Hey, welcome back to the eDrum Workshop. I'm Luke, and these are Fast Fit triggers from Jobeky. They were sent to me by Jobeky to try out and review, but as always, this review is all my own opinion from testing the triggers extensively, as you'll see. I can stay independent thanks to your support through my store over at the eDrumWorkshop.com, where you can buy kits, instruments and samples for your electronic drums, like those you just heard. So this is a multi-point fast fit design, and it's for a 14-inch drum with 4 head piezos under its foam cylinders. This one is a 12-inch trigger with 3 head piezos, and both of these have a rim trigger piezo tucked under this foam in the centre. The main advantage of this design is the lack of centre hotspot, which leads to a more consistent velocity response across the head in general. Now, wherever there's a trigger cone, there will always be some kind of hotspot, so technically, there are 3 or 4 hotspots, with the response kind of looking like this. This is typical across different brands though, and as you saw, they're not severe with this kind of design. This is a much more common trigger design nowadays, with a lot of major manufacturers moving to a variation on this theme. These triggers also have a good amount of headroom on the modules that I've tested them on, so I can make sure only my harder hits are triggering the higher velocities, which improves dynamics. If you're only looking for 2 distinct zones, head and rim, then these triggers generally perform well. When it came to modules that can also detect rim shots, so rim-only hits are one sound and a rim and head together are another, things become a little bit more complicated, and I'll get into that in the full trigger performance section. This trigger is a 14-inch centre-mounted design with a single head piezo under the centre cone and a rim trigger on the platform underneath. The main reason you would opt for this design is positional sensing compatibility with modules that support it. This is only really important on the snare in most cases, and the trade-off is a pretty dramatic hotspot in the centre where the velocity will spike at any given hit strength. This happens on all of my modules, and it's a pretty universal problem with centre triggers, not just this one. Roland, Gaver, Drumtech, you name it, anybody's centre triggers will do this. And that's the reason that the majority of manufacturers have moved away from centre cones for most pads. There is some behaviour that's specific to this trigger though, especially when paired with particular modules. I'll get into that shortly, but first I want to cover the design of these triggers because I really like it. Jobeky are a small family company that have been established for around 20 years in the UK, though they do ship worldwide. Throughout the years, they've always been evolving and adapting to the changing electronic drum landscape. One of my favourite adaptations is the move to non-destructive trigger installation. These triggers are a single drop-in unit with no need to make any permanent changes to the drum. The only hardware that needs removing is the batter side hoop and head. The trigger just sits on the bearing edge of the drum. There was a little give from side to side when I placed them on my drums, but I think that this sizing is intentional. They also have a smooth roll-off on their edge with a protective trim, which I like because I've seen some drop-in triggers that appear to have hard corners that look like they might add stress to the edge of the head. These fast fit triggers aren't the lightest of designs, being made of mostly steel, but that does make them feel very robust and premium, and I think that the design is very well thought out. The triggers use mini jack connections between the trigger body and the jack connection to the module, which I'm also a fan of. It keeps things simple if connections need replacing. To fully commit to the non-destructive philosophy, you can use a jack connector that mounts outside of the drum, so you only need to thread the cable through a vent hole. Otherwise, you could choose a more destructive approach with a barrel jack connector that can be mounted into the drum shell, either through the vent hole or through a drilled hole. Once the head goes back on, it's just a case of getting the tension where you want it and then connecting it up to your kit. Now, one point to note here is that they don't come with these jack connectors as standard. You'll need to add these on, and you can choose which connector type to go with from a page on the store. I already had spare jack connectors, so I didn't get any with mine. The external connector here is a DrumTech part. Unfortunately though, it turned out to be faulty, so I later replaced it with this barrel jack, which is easy to do with this design. If you don't have these parts though, you'll need to account for that as part of the cost of purchasing the triggers. Speaking of which, at the time of writing, the 12-inch multi-point trigger costs £99, which is roughly $131 or 114 euros. The 14-inch multi-point trigger is £119, which is roughly $158 or 137 euros. This 14-inch center trigger design is £89, which is around $118 or 102 euros. The cable connectors for the triggers are both priced at £16.50, which is around $22 or 19 euros. So once you add the connector on, you're looking at these prices. Considering the build quality and the simplicity of the installation, I think these prices are fair. The closest competition in the UK is Diamond Electronic Drums triggers. If you add on a jack connector to the Jobeky trigger, then they're pretty similarly priced, though bear in mind that the Diamond triggers are made of plastic rather than steel. There are also some cheap plastic trigger plates available from places like World Drummers. I did try out an old Centercone one a few years ago that performed pretty poorly, but I don't know what the new versions are like. Moving on to the performance, as you saw in the intro, they generally trigger well. I'm using Jobeky Prestige and DrumTech Real Feel heads on all of these pads. They're both 3-ply and feel identical, and I've got similar rubber rims on all of them too, so it's a pretty consistent setup. On my setup there have been some quirks that are unique to each trigger, and then some that are unique to each module. So I'm going to show the performance in more detail and discuss the pros and cons on a per module basis to keep things simple. So the main reason that you'd pick a center trigger on a Roland module is for positional sensing. Unfortunately, as you just saw, the head position only really tends towards the correct area. My center hits are often ranging between center and halfway to the edge, the latter of which can lead to a less impactful sound. I found that this was consistent across different pad presets that support positional sensing on the head. For the rim zone, hitting it alone should show as being at the edge to allow for rim clicks, and then shallow rim shots are just off the edge, and deep rim shots should show up as center on the rim position monitor. As you saw, a lot of my rim only hits were coming up as shallow rim shots. However, the center rim shots pretty much always land, so it really depends on how you use your snare. If you prefer to leave the cross stick enabled, then it won't really factor in, as I showed, but if you want this full range of articulation, you might not be able to achieve it with this trigger. If you have a TD-50X, TD-27, or even a V71, I imagine these results will be similar on that module, you'll probably be much better off with the digital snare if you can afford it. If you can't, or if you're looking for a side snare with positional sensing, you might be able to make do with this trigger. It just doesn't really excel at the few things that center triggers are meant to be better at. Roland's tom sounds don't support head positional sensing, so there's not really a lot of reason to go for center triggers there either. On the TD-17, it's a different story. There's no positional sensing, so there's only head and rim hits, and the separation between those is great with this pad. However, since those features aren't available, there's no real advantage of a center trigger because the big hotspot is still there. On the Roland TD-50X and TD-27, if I use a VAD pad preset like the PDA-120 and PDA-140F for the multi-point triggers, I can achieve head hits, rim-only hits, and rim shots with supported snare and tom sounds. Generally, I needed to bump up the rim gain a bit to even out the response. Now, both of these multi-point triggers do react a little differently, so setting the head rim adjust for each is important. It does seem that the 12-inch trigger doesn't do as well with lower velocity rim shots as the 14-inch trigger, and it takes a harder rim shot to trigger them properly. That has been consistent with some of the other modules that I've tested. If you're not bothered about having distinctions between rim clicks and rim shots, then you can turn off rim position, or you could use a different pad preset, or even just change the sound to one that doesn't support that function. And in that case, separation between the head and rim is great. I can get very dynamic rim and head hits with no issues. There's no head positional sensing with the pad preset type that I used, and if you choose a preset that does have it, it won't work properly as expected. If you're happy with the performance that I've showed though, then I'd really recommend these triggers on these modules. On the TD-17, since there's no positional sensing on the head or rim to worry about, it's really easy to dial the multi-point triggers in with most dual zone presets. I can achieve great separation and dynamics on both zones easily with the head rim adjust settings optimized for each trigger. So I can definitely recommend these as a snare or tom trigger on the TD-17. On the Pearl Mimic Pro, there was a bit of a balancing act when using the center trigger with the ATV 13-inch snare preset. This is the preset that's compatible with positional sensing. If I have the head input gain on 10, I get great positional sensing, but the rim input is a little bit low, meaning that low velocity hits on the rim don't get detected. If I increase the head gain even a single digit up to 11, the positional sensing behavior completely changes. Putting it up to 12 makes the rim trigger much better, and it gives me more consistent low velocity rim shots when I also adjust the other settings, but the positional sensing becomes less accurate on medium velocity head hits. To be honest, outside of this really focused testing that I'm doing, neither of these are big problems. In actual playing scenarios, I doubt I'm going to hit the rim as lightly as I do when I'm testing. This is also kind of the same with positional sensing. For consistent backbeat playing, I'm probably going to favour the middle of the pad. So either of these settings can work depending on how I want to play. If I forgo the positional sensing, then this isn't a problem, but then I've got a pad with a huge hotspot in the middle, so the multi-point would make more sense there. Now, the Mimic can do positional sensing with some multi-trigger pads, but I can't get the positional sensing to work reliably with either multi-point trigger as a snare on the Mimic. The preset was designed for the ATV 3-cone trigger pattern, and it works pretty well with some pads that are designed like that, but with these it just seems to jump around randomly on center hits. If you're not bothered about positional sensing, or you're just using these as tom pads, then dialing them in with a different dual trigger preset results in great head zone triggering. When it comes to the rim triggering, there are quite big differences between the 12-inch and the 14-inch multipoint. The 12-inch trigger seems to have a bit more crosstalk between the head and rim triggers, meaning that the rim trigger signal spikes quite high when playing the head at higher velocities. This makes dialing in rim shots specifically more awkward than I'd like, and it makes the window for a rim shot quite narrow, similar to the results on the Roland modules. If I set the rim shot threshold too low, then I'll get rim shots on the head zone with hard hits, so I have to set it pretty high, which means only a hard rim shot will accurately trigger. On the 14-inch trigger though, the rim signal doesn't seem to do this, so dialing those in is much easier. Once again, if you're not as bothered about rim click and rim shot distinctions though, whether that's on the snare or the toms, then you could change the settings so that there's only one sound on the rim zone, and that way they'll trigger each zone very well when dialed in properly. On the 2-box DrumIt 5 Mark II with the center trigger, I eventually got reasonable head and rim separation with the right settings, but it's not perfect. I had to use the X-Trig and X-Adjust quite heavily to achieve good zone separation. I was also getting some ghost rim triggers when hitting different areas of the head, so I had to increase the mask and rim threshold settings too. This meant that low velocity rim hits weren't really possible, and sometimes flams between the head and rim weren't always tracking properly. Otherwise it works okay, but there's still a big hotspot with this pad and no positional sensing on this module to make up for that. Overall, I got the multi-point triggers performing well on my 2-box DrumIt 5 Mark II. I had to use quite high X-Trig and X-Adjust settings to get good separation between the head and rim zones though. Fortunately, the only real downside to that is that a tight flam between the head and rim doesn't trigger very well, unlike on some other modules. This is a pretty niche thing to do though, so overall I'd say that these work well on this module once the settings are balanced well. On the Alesis Strike, I had some success with the center trigger, but it's not great. The head triggering works generally as expected, and I used the re-trigger setting on both the head and rim zones to dial out some of the dodgy re-triggers. This didn't negatively affect the ability to do rolls, fortunately. The rim, however, is very spotty. I had to crank up the sensitivity to get a decent response, and at first I thought it was playing quite well, but then I found out that it was only on sections of the rim. Some parts just don't trigger consistently, even with pretty extreme settings. Bad rim triggering is a problem that I've run into a lot though with third-party triggers on the Strike module, unfortunately, so this is consistent with other tests. On the Alesis Strike, the 12-inch multi-point trigger gave me good results. I had to boost the rim sensitivity pretty high to get a good response from it, but once I did that, I got good separation between head and rim, and a good dynamic range on each. The 14-inch trigger though was a completely different story. I could barely get the rim to trigger at all, even with extreme settings. The head zone also suffers similar re-triggers to the DrumIt 5 module and required extreme settings to fully dial out, which then affects the playability. So none of this is ideal, and again, the triggering on this module isn't the best with third-party pads, so I did kind of expect it. Huge improvements in triggering from Alesis on the Strata Prime module. I could dial in the center trigger to achieve great head zone triggering. On the rim zone, I could get rim only and rim shot triggering, though it's not perfect. I used some quite extreme settings to get the rim clicks to register at all, which means that I have to be pretty accurate with quite hard rim shots to get those to trigger. On the flip side, if you're not bothered about this feature, then a small tweak to the rim balance setting gives me a very dynamic single sound on the rim. The intense center hotspot remains though, and there's no positional sensing support, so the multi-point trigger might serve you better with this module. Yeah, the multi-point triggers work pretty great on this module for either snare or toms. Like the center trigger, getting the balance right with rim only and rim shot hits did take some quite extreme settings, and it's not always perfect. I found it easier to land dynamic rim shots on the 12-inch trigger than the 14-inch trigger as well. However, overall sensitivity, dynamics, and separation of head and rim are good, so if you don't need rim click and rim shot distinction, then you can adjust the rim balance setting to dial that out and get great two-zone triggering. The eDRUMin does very well with this center trigger. I spent quite a bit of time really dialing in the little boxes for the rim only and rim shot detection too. Some low velocity head hits on rolls were giving me rim hits until I got the settings just right. I also managed to dial in the hotspot suppression just enough to help balance the center a bit. I wanted to go more extreme with it, but then my low velocity center hits were getting a bit unpredictable. I can't quite find the balance which makes hits towards the edge as high velocity as I'd like them to be without cranking the gain too high. However, the positional sensing does help with this, and it's been very accurate. So the usual center trigger downfalls are there, but the eDRUMin does a good job of limiting them as much as it can. The eDRUMin continues to perform well with the multi-point triggers, even with their few quirks. It took a little bit of fussing over the settings to get the rim only and rim shot detection right again, but once I did, I could get dynamic results on all zones. As a bonus, I could also achieve positional sensing on the multi-point triggers thanks to some recently added settings. I'm not sure if I've fully got my head around these new controls for this pad type, but it's probably 95% accurate with both of these triggers, which is fantastic. This wasn't a given. This trigger preset is designed for the ATV snare and there's no guarantee that it will work with others, so I'm glad that it's worked here. This means that as far as I'm concerned, the multi-point triggers are a great pairing with the eDRUMin. So would I recommend these triggers overall? For most users, it's kind of hard to recommend the center trigger. Only a few modules support positional sensing, and Roland have moved to their digital snare, so single center triggers are becoming more and more of a niche use case than they were even a few years ago. For mimic owners who really want positional sensing and can live with a dramatic hotspot, this is a reasonable option, especially for the price. For the majority of users, the multi-point triggers are going to make a lot more sense. I can get similar or better playability out of them on the majority of modules. It's a shame that I can't get the best results on the Alesis Strike and that the 12-inch isn't perfect on some of the other modules. There must just be something about the way that each trigger engine works to cause this divide. Otherwise, they're still very good triggers that are well designed, built like a tank, and are competitively priced. If you want to see some other triggers in action, just go here. If you liked the sound examples in this video, then go check out my store over at the eDrumworkshop.com. But above all, enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers!